morning. Well, the rain stopped, the sun came out, and we were back to terra firma, huh? Did you get wet on the way home last night?
Very little, because Muhammad took care of me, delivered me to the hotel.
Oh, sorry.
So,
this is the first one, right?
Doesn't matter. Either way.
We could just press this. Just the right arrow.
Okay, and then we'll go to the second one. Okay.
That's it. And then let me just do a quick download.
Yep. Start there because I want you to see the slide. Start there, and then after I show the slide, you all can come up. You all, both of you, can come up. Yeah. Because, again, remember, the blind spot. I want you to see what I think is a blind spot for us, all right? You have to imagine a blind spot, right? You could be, somebody, say, I know I have a blind spot, I just don't know what it is. Then we could put up all the things like, none is more blind than he who refuses to see, seeing is believing. Did you do that in your book? No.
I tried to use some blindness and vision metaphors in there.
Is it more of a political discussion? Yes, okay.
Basically about why the United States is effective mediator.
And you have a high confidence in this one because the data is extensive. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
By the way, just please watch the...
I saw that dangerous thing. You want to see if I can jump 6 inches. It's close. Okay. We're on live now? Hi, everybody on live. We're live here, too. The ones that came in this morning are alive. They're smiling. They're anxious. And we are in day 2 of the 20th International Conference of the Holy Land Christian Ecumenical Foundation. We had a great day yesterday. Fabulous presenters. In fact, we have 25 expert presenters between the 2 days of programming, and we also have experts that are sitting in our audience here, and I'm sure that there are some experts on the live feed also. We welcome you if this is your first day to the conference, and we look forward to more good presentations, excellent presentations, and discussion today. Before I introduce this session specifically, I want to show a couple of slides. Is that visible and legible? We had some interesting discussion in the morning and the afternoon about the challenge that lies ahead for us in terms of informing people, educating people, getting people motivated, and getting people to act. And all that continuum is around the issue of Palestinians, Palestinian Christians, and now the broadened topic of how do we provide sustenance for the special, unusual, eternal city of Jerusalem. So I looked on the internet and found some data. Pew collects data, and they collected, I think, on an annual basis. And what they do is they were looking to quantify public opinion in the United States in terms of their sympathy for the Palestinian situation or the situation of the Jewish state in that area. And they looked at the data in terms of religion, how people profess, and then what their beliefs are, and also politically. So, to see it, I have to go away from the microphone, but I will be loud.
He'll still pick it up.
Yeah. So, it's a little fuzzy from the angle, but the title of this slide says, Liberal Democrats increasingly sympathize more with the Palestinians than with Israel. That's the title of the slide. But that's not really what the data are about. That's just what one of the charts is about. And you see it's divided over here, we have data for conservative Republicans. We have data for moderate or liberal Republicans. We have data for conservative or moderate Democrats, and we have data for liberal Democrats. And they're tracking this over a period of time from 2001 to 2016. So it's pretty recent, but it will not include events in the last 12 to 18 months. Okay, it will not include events for the last 12 to 18 months. So the declaration of the nation-state status for Israel and will not be reflected in these data, or any other things that have gone on, the uprisings and the repressions, the new repressions and all that. So what you see here is and these are reliable data. Pew is a very reliable research organization. They use good sample size, good questioning techniques, good statistical management. And so over time, we see for conservative Republicans, 73% of them, is that 73?
Maybe 79.
79 are more sympathetic toward Israel. And down here, we see a much lower, almost an insignificant percentage are more sympathetic toward Palestinians. When you go to slightly less conservative people, you see very same patterns. And notice how little change there is over a period of 15 years. Maybe little blips, but just very little change. Then you come down here and look at the conservative or moderate Democrats. And still, the number that are sympathetic with the Palestinians is very low. Is that 19%? It just doesn't do well from the side. And so it's almost 3 times as high sympathy for Israel. And not until you get to liberal Democrats do you see where the sympathies, and that's in 2016, actually cross over the sympathies for Israel. Now, I don't know what percentage of Americans consider themselves liberal Democrats, but let's say it might be 25%. Do you know? No. Let's say it's 25%. So the burden for us, the challenge for us, if we're trying to change knowledge and attitudes, look at what we're facing. The suggestion here is going forward with this, we better think about targeting messages, targeting opportunistic channels, because it would take a $1 billion public relations program and probably a decade to try to move all of them. Let's look at the next view on this. And this looks by faith orientation. We got Protestants, we got evangelical Protestants, white mainland, black Protestants, and we go down to the Catholics with their then we've got, and what you see here is still, by religion, look at the tilt toward Israel, and the tilt is so strong for Protestants, that's like five times more sympathetic. Protestants, my people. White evangelicals, 79. I think that might be 85 or 90 now, if I had to guess. And white mainline, that would be, I guess, your Episcopalians, your Lutherans, your Methodists, maybe Baptists, and then your black Protestants right there. Catholics, what would be your guess? Would they be more sympathetic toward Palestinians? 50% of Catholics. This is the fake media jumping in on me. They're ready? Huh? No, bring them up. Alternative. Somebody thought I was putting up alternative facts. So anyway, what I hope that you were able to see is
Hello.
That, how are you this morning?
Fine.
We'll be incorporating you into a panel here within about 1.5 minutes. Is that okay?
1.5 minutes. Okay.
1.5 minutes. Yeah, 90 seconds.
Okay.
So I think what you don't see the data anymore, but you have seen the data. And I think it's pretty impressive data that tells us we've got a major challenge to change knowledge, attitude, motivations, and actions in the United States anyway, whether it's by religious or political orientation. Yesterday there was a suggestion that one group that we might reach out to effectively would be the liberal Jewish groups, because we didn't show liberal Jewish group on there, but they would probably fall into your more liberal democratic side, I'm thinking. That may be a good partnering channel for us. So I just want to share that kind of a transition, and that may have relevance to some of the things we'll discuss today. Jewish settlements in East Jerusalem and West Bank and the Israeli separation wall on Palestinian territories, they've complicated Palestinian daily life. And they've been serious obstacles to peace between Palestinians and Israelis. This presentation, this panel this morning, will focus on their impact on Palestine and the larger issue of peace. Now, I'd like to ask up our panelists, and we'll ask up our Skype panelists electronically. I'd like to welcome Dr. Hannah Hanania, who's going to chair this session. One interesting little fact, interesting to me, is we're kindred. We're from the same tribe. We're both dentists, if you can imagine that. Don't get nervous. We're not going to do any of that stuff to you this morning. And I'd like to ask you to come up and introduce your panel.
Thank you, Steve.
خطني لما صل 13 رجل بتلك كلها.
Thank you, Steve, for sharing these numbers with us. Growing up in Palestine, we always used to say, I used to hear a lot of older people saying, if America knew, things would be much better in Palestine. And I think you're just hitting back into that point that we've been saying for a very long time. I agree with you. Targeting the right group might be the best way to go. I also want to thank you for the event last night, Steve. I think you did a really, really amazing job showing the work of HSBC the last 20 years. I want to take a minute to thank Sir Ratib for starting this great organization. I've been involved with this organization for pretty much the 20 years. When Ratib talked to me about starting the group 20 years ago, I was telling him this is not something that's going to work. It's very complicated. To add the Christian component to the Palestinian issue might not make things work smooth. But through the years, Ratib has proved with the hard work he's doing that what he's doing is such an amazing thing. I usually try to visit Palestine once a year, and one of the highlights of my visits is always visiting the work of HCEF. Going to Bethlehem and seeing the people who work for the organization, who were able to raise their families because of the jobs that were created by HCEF was amazing. And seeing the great work being done has always been a hope in a very dark world. Thank you for joining us today. We're so privileged to have two distinguished guests with us this morning. We're going to be talking mainly about the settlements and the barrier war. For those of you who don't know what the settlements are, it's basically civil communities, mainly dominated by Jewish Israelis in a Palestinian land. It's in the land that was occupied in 1967 after the war there. Most of them today are located in the West Bank, even though there is some settlements in the Golden Heights. According to B'Tselem, an Israeli information center on human rights, there is 600,000 settlers in the West Bank today, in 200 different communities. Just to give you an idea what settlements looks like, I grew up in a city called Ramallah. Ramallah is 16 miles north of Jerusalem. Right next to Ramallah, there is a small village called Derduan. I used to have a good friend who lives in Derduan. We were roughly 10 minutes apart, roughly a 4 miles trip. They built a settlement somewhere next to Derduan. And after that, they start changing the roads around. So that 10-minute drive, because they were not allowing the Palestinians to use the roads around that settlement, they were only exclusive for Jewish use in that area, it became a half-an-hour trip. A half-an-hour trip in an area like the West Bank, where security is a major issue, security not from crime, but security from settlers, made huge changes in his life. For 10 years, I used to visit Palestine. I was never able, for example, to go out with him, because by 5 p.m. he want to be back in the village, because now he has to take a very, very
أنا
long way
مبين
to be
هيك
able to go to the
أنا
village.
مبين عندهم.
I know. Muhammad, they hear us on Skype?
Yeah, they can hear.
Okay. So that was basically, and that affected his kids, affected the way they go to school and everything else. And that was just a very, very simple example of how settlements are changing things in the West Bank. Not to mention that the land that they built on, for the most part, was owned by Palestinian owners who they took their land away from them, and they still live right next to it. Now imagine how much every day they would feel when they cannot go to whatever it used to be, like their olive trees and so on. And this is something continuously happening every day. After that, they decided to build what we know as a separation barrier, or the wall. 85% of it was built inside the West Bank, according to Bethlehem, the same center. And what was the biggest disaster with the wall is that in many areas it ended up breaking communities apart, communities that lived for generations. Talking about different villages, in many areas it was just basically a wall drawn on the map without looking any consideration of what's happening to the people on the ground. I'm going to let our experts elaborate more on that issue. It's a great pleasure to have such two distinguished speakers with us today. I would like to introduce Dr. Jad Ishaq. Dr. Jad is the Director General of the Applied Research Institution, Jerusalem, ARIJ, which is a leading Palestinian institute that conducts research on agriculture, environment, land use, and water. He's a former Dean of Science at Bethlehem University. He has published more than 100 articles and books in his field of interest. He headed the Palestinian Delegation of Environmental Working Group in the multilateral talks and is an advisor to the Palestinian Negotiation Affairs Department. He's a part of many committees that work on many different issues. It's a great pleasure to have you with us, Dr. Jad. Can you hear us?
Thank you. Thank you.
Please, Dr. Jad.
Good morning, everybody. I really regret that I haven't been in person, been able to come and speak to you, but I hope this technology will substitute for it. In the next 15 minutes, I'll try to show you some maps and figures to outline what I call the settlement enterprise, which is undermining the two-state solution. The title that I chose is The Paradigm Shift in the Israeli-Palestinian Peace, which happened mainly as a result of the Trump administration during the past year and a half. I would like to remind you that when we were invited to the Madrid Peace Conference, it was explicitly made to us that a comprehensive peace will be based on United Nations Security Resolutions 242 and 338, which says very clearly the non-admissibility of acquiring land by force. And on October the 18th, 1991, the United States sent us this letter of assurance, which says, we do not recognize Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem or the extension of its municipal boundaries, and we encourage all sides to avoid unilateral acts that would exacerbate local tensions. This is just a joke, because what happened last year is totally different to what the letter of assurances was given to us. What we as Palestinians aspired for is a Palestinian state based on the 4th of June 67 border, which is the West Bank and Gaza, and a corridor that links to them. This is not a fair solution, but it was a real political solution, which the PLO and the Palestinian leadership accepted, granting Israel 78% of mandate. When we started the peace process, we understood that Israel was doing facts on the ground, and there was a sentence in the Oslo Agreement, which said that neither side would take any action that will jeopardize the outcome of final status negotiations. But unfortunately, Israel has been defying this agreement. And if you look at this map, you can see the growth of settlements, especially in the last 3 or 4 slides. These are the expansion of settlements that happened after the peace process. From 1990 to 2017, Palestinians witnessed an accelerated expansion of settlements and settlement master plans and the confiscation of their land. Originally, they started closing Palestinian areas for military purposes or for mined areas between us and Jordan, or as nature reserves, or as declared state land from by the occupation forces. If you add all these elements together, you will come to the conclusion that Israel has already consolidated its control over 45% of the West Bank. For the Palestinian layman, what they saw is that in 1992, when the peace process started, there were only 248,000 settlers over an area of 77 square kilometers. Yet, when we look at the same map in 2018, we see that the settlement area expanded almost 3-fold. The number of settlers now is not 600,000, it's 816,000. And there are 220 outposts, which you will see they are more dangerous because an outpost by which one settler can occupy a hilltop and declare this as a land under his or her control. The aerial photos that we analyzed shows that there are 198 Israeli settlements and 220 outposts. Between 2015 and 2017, the expansion that took place, if you can see, mainly in the Bethlehem and Jerusalem area, about 1/3 of the settlement expansion took place in these two governorates. And in the Jordan Valley, Israel is rapidly de-Palestinizing that area through forced displacement of Bedouins. The Bedouin communities are distributed all over the West Bank. Here are their locations, and Israel is trying to either move them somewhere else, which is ethnic displacement, or through declaring their areas as military zones. These are 3 examples. What's happening here in the Ma'ali Adumim, and I'll talk about it in Khan al-Ahmar. They want to make all this settlement block free of Palestinians. Or in the Jordan Valley, they are restricting all these red areas. They are all received demolition orders or evacuation orders. And in the south of the West Bank, all these localities here, the 8 localities there, Khirbats around the southern Hebron, have received eviction orders. And in Khan al-Ahmar, these are the communities in Khan al-Ahmar, which Israel has even decided that they should be moved somewhere else. And it's a matter of time before, despite all international pressure, Israel is adamant they want to relocate these areas. The outposts, as I said, came as a result of Sharon, who said everybody has to move, run, and grab as many hilltops as they can to enlarge the settlement blocks, because everything we take now will stay ours. Everything we don't grab will go to them. So Israel, the settlers, tried to take as much land as possible through these settlement outposts. Here are the areas A and B, and here is the wall. And you can see there are 80 Israeli outposts in the western part of the wall. There are 32 in the Jordan Valley. But what is really affecting the Palestinian contiguity are the outposts in the corridors linking the east and the west. And as a result of that, the Palestinian state is becoming a state of bantustan's with no possible contiguity or sustainability or viability. I believe that the outposts are the most dangerous issue together with the settlements on the two-state solution. And this is despite the fact that the Quartet Roadmap of 2002 says very clearly that Israel should dismantle outposts erected since March 2001. Unfortunately, Israel has legitimized these outposts, and they are becoming either part of the settlements or that they are included in the master plans of the settlements. To show you how these outposts are destroying the two-state solution, here is an example of East Nali. This is an outpost that was erected in 2014. And if you see what happened in 1 year in this area, you can see this outpost almost allowed the settlement to double its size. So one outpost caused this expansion or extraordinary expansion of the settlement. Lately, we heard the Prime Minister Netanyahu saying that they want to keep control of the Jordan Valley, saying that Israel will never abandon the settlements because they are of utmost security importance. And at present, most of the settlers that were evacuated from the Gaza Strip have been brought in the Jordan Valley. What Israel is trying to do through the settlement enterprise is to convert the settlement in blocks, to agglomerate them in blocks, which will compromise 75% of Area C or 45% of the West Bank, leaving the Palestinians to a mere 55% of the West Bank, which makes it totally unviable or extremely unacceptable to the Palestinians. Settlers' attacks are increasing considerably. These are examples of what happened between January and September 2018, whether they are cutting trees, they are losing land, they are burning trees, they are attacking mosques, churches, and even cars and individual Palestinian farms. These violations are taking place, and not one single settler was arrested for committing these acts. At the same time, Israel is trying to legitimize these through the Knesset. For example, the land regulation bill is allowing the Israeli state to confiscate private Palestinian land for settlements. Remember that what Mr. Hani has mentioned, about 50% of the land of the settlements is privately owned by Palestinians. Yet the regulation law allows the state to confiscate this land. The United Jerusalem Bill requires 80 Knesset members to change the status of Jerusalem, while not a simple majority of 61. And you know the system in Israel, I don't think there's any government that will get 80%. So therefore, the Jerusalem Bill will stay. At the same time, Palestinians are being denied to go to the Supreme Court, and instead they are asked to go to the Jerusalem District Court, where, for example, last month, the District Court decided that if the settlements were built in good faith, then there is no need to evacuate them. This is how ironic the situation is with the Israeli legal system. Israel also passed a law in March allowing the Interior Minister to revoke the Palestinian resident status of Palestinians in East Jerusalem who are engaged either in terror or anti-Israeli activities. The Greater Jerusalem Bill was passed, which allowed the borders of Jerusalem to expand to include 3 major settlement blocks. and I would say 4, in fact. Giv'at Ze'ev, Ma'ali Admim, and Gosh Etzion, and I will show you what does that mean. Finally, in July, Israel passed the Jewish State Bill, which says very clearly the right to exercise national self-determination is unique to the Jewish people, and there is no mention of any equality for the 20% who are the Palestinian population in Israel proper. And it says also that the development of Jewish settlement is a national value and will act to encourage these settlements. In Jerusalem, what is happening is that Israel changed through gerrymandering, changed the status of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was one city until 1947, when it was after 1949, it was divided into East and West Jerusalem. Under the Jordanian time, the East Jerusalem expanded a little bit, and Israel in 1967 declared this municipal boundary of Jerusalem, taking all this land, about 25,000 dunums, from the cities of Bet Sahur, Bethlehem, and Beit Jal. Nobody in the world recognizes this border of Jerusalem, except perhaps for the American administration. And they declared 2/3 of East Jerusalem, which is owned by the Palestinians, and as green areas where Palestinians are denied the right to develop or to utilize these areas. As for the settlements, Israel now has 55,000 settlement units ready for construction. The plans have passed the objections and they are awaiting implementation. And here are the town planning schemes that have been approved and ready for implementation. And you can see Palestinian localities in Jerusalem are becoming strangulated with the expansion of settlements, while the settlements are enjoying contiguity and potential expansion in the future. As a result, Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem are becoming human warehouses. I will show you one example, what I mean by this, because this is really an issue which will face us during the coming year. Here I will choose to show you what is happening with Kufr Aqab and Semiramis. This, it's part of municipal boundary of Jerusalem, and the rest is in Area C. This area is about 6,650 dunums. Israel built a settlement and confiscated this land as a result of the wall. This is the settlement that was built on Semiramis. What is left of Kufr Aqab is this area, which is approximately 2,400 dunums. When we try to see how many people are living there, West Bankers alone are about 14,000 people. But because Israel is denying Jerusalemites the right to construct and to build in their Palestinian neighborhoods, many Jerusalemites are now moving to live in Kufr Aqab. So the population there reached 65,000, which means that the population density in Kufr Aqab now is 46,000 people per square kilometer, which is the highest in the world. And according to the plan, the Trump administration, they would like to relinquish Kufr Aqab and give it to the Palestinian Authority, where 46,000 people per square kilometer, no infrastructure. It is almost like a black hole. I don't know how can we make it viable or sustainable. Israel also is working in Silwan to convert it into a mixed neighborhood. All these houses shown here in green and red have been taken one by one, and now they plan to build the King's Garden on this brown area, which will result in 80 Palestinian houses to be demolished and to replace them for the building settlements or a community center for the tourism. Israel has revoked about 15,000 Jerusalemites from their residency, and unfortunately, the status of Palestinians in Jerusalem have been changed from a citizen to a permanent resident for 10 years, which you can understand the implications of such. So they are becoming, not citizens, not indigenous population, but they are at the mercy of the Israeli government. What is happening in Jerusalem is that with the expansion of the borders to include these three major settlement blocks, the population of Palestinians, the percentage, which is now 38%, will drop down to 20%, because I believe that Israel wants to add these three settlement blocks plus another finger, which is where it will link Jerusalem to Beit El. That's where the American ambassador Friedman lives, and this will be another portion added, which means the Palestinian population will go down from 37.7%. By simple gerrymandering, they are playing with the indigenous population, and Palestinians will be limited to less than 12% of the area that of these expanded borders to be able to survive. In sum, I believe that the international community still adopted the two-state solution, but Israel is defying this approach. The USA appointed itself as the sole broker of the peace process, marginalizing the roles of the Quartet, the UN, and the EU. The Trump administration does not see the settlement enterprise as undermining the two-state solution, and they overturn the long-standing commitment to the two-state solution. Israel is exploiting the turmoil in the Middle East and the blind support of the USA to accelerate its unilateral actions. At the same time, the Israeli public has been indoctrinated. This territory is not occupied, but rather disputed. The historic attachments to Judea and Samaria, and Jerusalem, the united capital, eternal capital of Israel. And of course, Abu Mazen is not a Palestinian partner. Regrettably, on the agenda, on the world agenda, the Palestinian cause has been relegated. Here, I don't want to talk too much about it, but since 2018, Trump and the Palestinians cutting down the funding to the Palestinian Authority, opening the consulate in East Jerusalem, cutting the aid by 200 million, changing the status of the refugees, saying that there are only 40,000 refugees, stopping all funding to UNRWA, cutting the aid even to Jerusalem hospitals, and closing the PLO mission in Washington, revoking visas for the PLO envoy in Jerusalem, and even for NGOs involved in conflict resolution, $10 million were cut. During the Trump administration, Israel passed for the first time in its history 202 plans in 65 Israeli settlements. And this is taking place right now, which means that the two-state solution should now be wiped, because on the ground, it cannot become possible. Finally, I would like to show you the detours that are taking place in the road to peace in the Middle East. These are what the peace road would have given us, a two-state solution based on 67 border. Here, what Israel is trying to do is to sever the Gaza Strip from the West Bank and give the Gaza to become the emirate of Palestine, or continuing the status quo, which is very favorable for Netanyahu, or try to mix the two by giving us about 50% of the West Bank plus Gaza, or like some people like the INSS, they are talking about 65% of the West Bank to be given to the Palestinian state, but at the same time ignoring totally Gaza, or like what people like Gidon Biger and the Minister of Defense, Avigdor Lieberman, he would like even to transfer some Palestinians from within Israel to be moved to the West Bank. Otherwise, we will continue waiting for the peace process merry-go-round. Unfortunately, I don't see a way out of the situation, but Palestinians now should insist for a multilateral patronage of the negotiations, including the UN, the Quartet, and the Arab League, but not leave it to become hostage to the American administration, and stop dragging the conflict. We have been negotiating for 25 years and we didn't see an end of the conflict. Israel, the United States should retract its recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, because it undermines the basis of the two-state solution, and funding to UNRWA should be continued. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jad. That was very, very useful information. I remember growing up, Kfar Aqab was a very small neighborhood on the outskirts of Ramallah, was a very undeveloped, with very little people living in it. Now, because Kfar Aqab happened to be inside the barrier wall, a lot of people are moving from Jerusalem to it. Because many times when they built that wall, like there's so many families that their kids, for example, go to school inside the wall, outside the wall. And to cross through the wall, sometimes it's a 2-hour trip. So what many of them end up moving. So this very small neighborhood outside Ramallah became pretty much double the population inside this whole city. It became 65,000 people living in it. Probably there were less than a few hundred people just 20 years ago. Thank you, Dr. Jad. Our next speaker is a very caring friend who I had the privilege of working with on many exciting projects in the past. He dedicated a major part of his life promoting human rights to all. Khalid, a pleasure to have you with us today. Khalid Al-Jindi is a fellow in the Center of Middle East Policy at Brooklands and a founding board member of the Egyptian-American Rule of Law. I'm always excited to get your articles and read your analysis on the situation, Khalid, and I'm very excited that you're finalizing your book, Blind Spot, America and the Palestinians, from Balfour to Trump. Great pleasure to have you with us, Khalid.
Thank you, Hanna, and thank you all. Is it okay if I stand at the microphone? Because I have a couple slides actually to run through. A lot of my slides, well, actually, it's just one slide, sort of focus in on Jerusalem. So given the focus on Jerusalem, I'm going to, unfortunately, or fortunately, in the sake of, or in the interest of emphasis, I'm going to sort of overlap with a lot of what Jad had to say in terms of the reality on the ground. And then I want to talk mainly about the political implications. This is a map, of course, of Jerusalem. You can see the Palestinian built-up areas from Ramallah in the north to Bethlehem in the south. You see that Central Ridge really is the main population hub of the West Bank along the center strip of the West Bank. And, of course, East Jerusalem in the center. Historically, the cultural, financial, economic, certainly religious and political center of Palestinian life. Since 1967, we've seen, of course, a very, very dramatic sort of rewriting the landscape on the ground by Israeli settlements of the. My data is slightly different than Jad's. I count about 650,000 Israeli settlers throughout the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. I may be undercounting because I'm relying primarily on Israeli official sources. But in any case, almost 2/3 of that number live in this box right here in the greater metropolitan Jerusalem area. So at least 400,000 Israeli settlers living in this area. Of course, this is only part of the picture. The actual settlements, the settlement roads, fragment Palestinian life even further. And the wall is sort of the icing on the cake in terms of Palestinian territorial, physical, and social fragmentation. Already you see inside the municipal lines of Jerusalem, the settlements are dividing up Palestinian neighborhoods. This is not an organic process. Settlements don't grow simply because people decide to move somewhere. These are strategically, every house, virtually every house, every road, every stone that is laid is part of a strategic plan. If not an officially published government master plan, then certainly an informal vision for Israel's complete control, first of the area surrounding the old city, right in the center, and then in the municipal area of Jerusalem, and then a ring of settlement blocks around greater Jerusalem, all of which is designed, of course, to consolidate Israeli control over the whole of Jerusalem. And in fact, what Israel is doing is consolidating its control over the entire West Bank as well. The peace process was supposed to undo this process. 25 years later, of course, we've seen only more and more deepening of the occupation and deepening of Israeli settlements and associated infrastructure. The result that we have is you have about 300,000 Palestinians who are affected inside East Jerusalem, historically Palestinian East Jerusalem, who are cut off from the West Bank. They're not part of the Palestinian Authority. They don't get services. They don't get government services that other West Bankers do. And they're also denied services by the Israeli municipality. Palestinians make up about 38% of the city's population, but get just 12% of their portion of the municipal budget is about 12%. So as Jad and Hannah mentioned, many Jerusalemites leave Jerusalem to go live in areas where there's where they can build, but also where there are more economic opportunities, where it's easier to get to school in the West Bank. And so that is also part of Israel's plan, of course, is to de-Palestinianize Jerusalem. The more who can be encouraged to leave to the West Bank, and including, I mean, you have, if any of you have ever been there, areas like Adram and Abu Dis, Adram up here and Abu Dis, are literally walled ghettos. They're very concentrated urban centers that are almost entirely surrounded by the Israeli wall. And this is in the 21st century that we have these walled ghettos going up. But Israel's plans are not just physical, of course. Part of the reality for Palestinians in Jerusalem that they've grown accustomed to is separate and unequal treatment, and a lack of opportunities, a lack of economic opportunities. As a result, about 75% of East Jerusalem's Palestinians live under the poverty line. And as part of the Israeli drive to de-Palestinianize Jerusalem, of the 14,000 or so Jerusalem ID holders who've had their residency rights revoked, more than half of them, about 7,600, have been in the last 10 years. So what we're seeing really is since really the collapse of the peace process in the mid-2000s, we've seen an intensification of this drive to create facts on the ground, whether it's control over the Jordan Valley or control over Jerusalem, or removing Palestinian populations from those two areas in particular. As a result, Palestinians not only lack opportunities, but they're deprived of institutions. Starting in 2001, when Israel closed the Orient House, the unofficial PLO headquarters that had existed in East Jerusalem even before, as a Palestinian political center, even before Israel occupied the area in 1967. In addition, it closed other institutions like the Chambers of Commerce, the Higher Council on Tourism, the Prisoners Club, the Palestinian Center for Research, and we've seen a very consistent drive to suppress Palestinian cultural activities in Jerusalem, and any real expression of Palestinian identity or nationalism is also suppressed. Even book fairs and children's festivals, anything that might display a Palestinian identity is seen by Israel as a threat. And at the same time, we've seen a growing extremism on the Israeli side. We have these annual provocations that happen at the Haram al-Sharif, the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, which Jews identify as the Temple Mount. And these have become flashpoints for clashes and for violence. And the extremists really in Israeli society are no longer in the fringes. You know, the ideology that killed Yitzhak Rabin, Yigal Amir, the extremist who murdered the Israeli prime minister for beginning a peace process with the Palestinians, that ideology is now in control of Israeli politics. If not the prime minister himself, then certainly members, even more extreme members of his coalition. And yet the peace process has focused primarily on trying to reform Palestinian politics. And certainly there are issues with Palestinian institutions and Palestinian governance and Palestinian politics, but it is completely neglected in the process the very problematic nature of Israeli politics, particularly since Israel holds most of the cards as the occupying power. So shifting gears now to the political implications. I alluded to the fact that Jerusalemites in particular have a real sense of abandonment, not only by the peace process, but by their own leaders. And it's similar, I think, to the situation in Gaza, which is also cut off and isolated in a much more aggressive and complete manner. But it's important not to underestimate the extent to which Palestinians in Jerusalem are also essentially under a siege of sorts. And in some ways, and certainly life in Gaza is considerably worse than life for Palestinians in the West Bank. But in some ways, it's worse for Jerusalemites because they have no political leadership. They have no institutions in Jerusalem the way they do in Gaza or in the West Bank. And that's a very important distinction and not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence also that the two areas that we have seen the most serious and episodic consistent violence are also the two areas that have been excluded from the peace process and are beyond the control of the Palestinian Authority, namely Gaza and East Jerusalem. These are the two areas that we keep coming back to in terms of crises. Gaza, of course, Israel and the United States are intent on isolating Hamas, and they don't want to deal with Hamas as a political force. Jerusalem is isolated because Israel wants to maintain exclusive Jewish control and to reduce a Palestinian and Arab presence and identity of the city. And the peace process, which again, I want to emphasize, was supposed to be working against these trends, has actually enabled all of these trends. I have an article out from a few months ago sort of summarizing the thesis of my book, and I think you'll get it just from the title, How the Peace Process Killed the Two-State Solution. And I know that sounds snarky, but I genuinely believe that the peace process not only was ineffective under American stewardship, but actually did more harm than good. It's very difficult to underestimate or to excuse me, to overstate the significance of Trump's Jerusalem declaration, recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moving the embassy there. Not since Harry Truman has a president made such a weighty and important and far-reaching foreign policy decision based solely on domestic politics. We all know that domestic politics has played a role in U.S. policy when it comes to the peace process, but it has traditionally been offset to some extent by other concerns, by other interests, strategic interests, the concerns of its Arab allies, Saudi Arabia or Egypt or Jordan or other partners in the region, its desire for stability, its desire not to want to alienate more than a billion Muslims in the world. But the declaration, the Jerusalem Declaration, was very similar in that sense to Truman's decision to recognize Israel within just a few minutes of Israel's Declaration of Independence against U.S. policy and against the advice of his State Department at that moment, and several State Department, his UN staff, State Department officials at the UN were about to resign en masse because of what Truman did at the very last second in recognizing Israel. And I think it's comparable to what Trump has done against the advice of the State Department and even the Pentagon and the intelligence community. This was a decision based solely on domestic politics. Every president since Truman has understood that there can be no viable peace without Jerusalem. Since the late 1990s or early 2000s, American presidents have understood that a Palestinian state would require a capital in East Jerusalem. President Clinton understood that. President Bush understood that. Obama understood that. This president not only does not understand that, but is actually rewriting the rules of the peace process so that we're no longer really talking about 242 and land for peace and even a two-state solution, but something very, very different. I don't accept the idea that this administration is working for a two-state solution with a different emphasis or in a different way. I think what this administration has in mind is not a sovereign Palestinian state of any kind, but really a consolidation of the status quo, a normalization of the one-state reality that exists under Israeli occupation. Jerusalem, of course, you all know the Palestinians have been boycotting the Trump administration since the Jerusalem Declaration. But as I suggested, the U.S.-led peace process was already dead really before Trump came to office. As I mentioned, 242 has been eroded over time. It wasn't simply a leap that Trump made at the last minute. The United States has insisted on 242 as a pillar of the peace process, while at the same time never challenging Israel's occupation. The United States has frowned on settlement activity. Every administration has said that it's bad. Whatever language they used, whether it's watered down or not, they've always said that settlements are bad, but at the same time, those very same presidents have built in various loopholes to allow Israel to continue building settlements, particularly in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the big exemption from a settlement freeze in the 90s, in the 2000s, and of course today it's actually being normalized essentially by the Trump administration. Over time, for the Palestinians, the costs of the peace process have steadily gone up, while the potential returns have steadily gone down. Again, this was a process that was happening over the last 25 years at least, and it was not simply something that happened with President Trump. Trump is sort of the icing on the cake, but the peace process was already dead. What Trump has done essentially is to dance on the grave of the Oslo process. So we're now we're not entering, but we're actually in an entirely new phase. where we're probably not dealing with a two-state solution. I don't know how we get to a two-state solution where the party that controls things on the ground and the chief mediator no longer support a two-state solution. Israel and the United States. It cannot be only that Palestinians are the only, and the Europeans, and to a certain extent the Arab states, are the only ones now who officially support a two-state solution, but those who are in a position to try and make it a reality are simply no longer there. And so we need to think about alternatives. But more than anything else, I think we need to see a Palestinian leadership that is much more cohesive, that is much more strategic, much less dependent on the United States than it has been for the past many years. We need a Palestinian leadership that will emphasize Palestinian agency and that can reunify its ranks. Otherwise, I see that as the very first step before there can be any sort of talk about a diplomatic solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Khaled. I'm just trying to reconnect Dr. Jed to join us for the question and answer session. But until he joins us, we'll go ahead and start taking some questions, please. Go ahead, Mayor.
Khaled, you mentioned that the peace process is actually more damaging than helpful for the Palestinian people. Could you elaborate on a few examples of how that's the case, please?
I'm sorry, just before, I forgot to say, basically, we have two microphones to use it. But Maher, your voice was clear.
Right to your left, there's a microphone.
I think we were very clear, yeah. But for the future references.
Khaled, you mentioned that the peace process is more damaging than helpful. Could you give some examples of how that's the case, please?
Yeah, I think for starters, the power imbalance that exists on the ground was really institutionalized by the Oslo process. And I would say exaggerated further. I mean, that's written into the accords, the power imbalance. You see that with the whole Area A, B, C designations. But it's been exaggerated further by American management of this process. Just a quick example. After the collapse of the Camp David talks, any credible analyst, and even former Israeli and American negotiators who've written about it, have made clear there were mistakes made on all sides. But what happened after the collapse of Camp David in 2000 is that Bill Clinton made a political decision to put all of the blame on Yasser Arafat, even though as American negotiators learned later on over the next several months of negotiations, that the Barak's proposal may have been far-reaching by Israeli standards, but didn't reach the minimum requirements of Palestinians for a sovereign state. And that finally sunk in by the time we get to the Clinton parameters several months later in December of 2000. But in the interim, Bill Clinton had no problem pinning the blame on Yasser Arafat. In other words, shifting the costs, that political costs of the failure entirely onto the weakest party. And I think this is the fundamental and fatal flaw of an American-led peace process, is that it focuses on essentially putting pressure on the weaker side, on the Palestinians, and not putting pressure on the Israeli side. And this has been true of Republican and Democratic presidents. George H.W. Bush, the father, is the last American president to actually put any meaningful pressure on Israel. That's one of the great ironies of the peace process, is that the philosophy of the process was based on the idea that we have to hug Israel and make Israel feel secure and confident in order for them to make risks, to take risks for peace and make those concessions. Well, the opposite has proven true. By shielding Israel from criticism at the UN, or not pressuring it on settlements, or coddling Israel when it uses excessive force, that has essentially let Israel off the hook, and most of the pressure has been put on the weaker side. And so that's why we've seen over the last 25 years, Israel's become even stronger and more triumphalist, and the Palestinians have grown even weaker. They were always the weak party, there's no question. But look at where Yasser Arafat was and his leadership 25 years ago, and where the current leadership is in terms of its internal fragmentation and weakness and lack of cohesiveness. And a lot of that, of course, is self-inflicted, but a lot of it is also encouraged by the peace process.
Please. Thank you, Khalid.
First of all, I want to compliment both these presenters on these excellent, comprehensive, evidence-based presentations that I think arise to the level of investigatory evidence. And what you've done is you've drawn me in this session to a couple of conclusions. I think that occupation as a term of art that's been used for a number of years and decades now is totally inadequate and is actually a barrier to getting the attention we need. Because occupation almost sounds like status quo, passivity, don't make anything boil over and all that. Yesterday, we had a little bit of discussion about the term apartheid. And I noted that a lot of people in the West think that apartheid is a radical term that should not be thrown around facilely for these kinds of situations. And I think yesterday we might have come to the conclusion that if you look at the parameters of apartheid in history, they're there. They're there. Now, I had already written down the word here, siege, before you brought it up. And I think there is some lexicon here that comes out of decades of terrible experiences for the world. And in this case, I think what we're seeing is a multi-pronged siege to choke off Palestinian society and coalesce Israeli occupation. So to me, this kind of terminology is really critical for communicating it to people that aren't insiders on this stuff, whether they be in Europe or they be in the Pacific or they be in the United States. I'm seeing evidence of pogroms. The word pogrom startles and reminds Jewish people about things that have happened in the past and may still happen in some places. Broad human rights violations. Cultural genocide. Now, when I'm a scientist, and I'm giving you terms, I'm trying to find descriptive terms based on objective evidence that I'm seeing in the record. And finally, one that makes me shudder a little bit is, I think based on the evidence we see, and you pretty much suggest this, that Israel has come up with the definitive solution, a type of final solution that can be executed within just the widest boundaries of human immorality, and that this final solution basically freezes a population through ghettoization, internment camps, and imprisonment. Now, I'm not intending that these be seen as inflammatory or rhetorical comments. I'm telling you, I'm trying to be as level-headed and analytical about this as I can. And I think it's time to move on to the next, let's define our terms, let's use them in a negotiating and diplomatic way rather than a strict accusative way, because even people who don't know Palestine well or these situations do have a sense of things in history, whether it's Rwandan genocide or the slaughter of the Jews or the indigenous people in America. The footprints, these horrid footprints of history are there, and they're being traced out right before our very eyes. We've got to go to the next level. Thank you.
Thank you. There was a question I was asking. I'd like to comment.
Go ahead and disagree with me on that. Come on. I think he was
Go ahead,
first.
Ambassador.
Khalid, David Mack from the Middle East Institute. And I've always appreciated the realism you bring to this issue based on your past experiences with both our government and the Palestinian Authority government, and at least at times across the table to the Israeli government. So I'm going to ask you if you agree to the following assumptions about what the U.S. government should do, about what the Palestinian leadership should do, and about what organizations like HCEF should do. As for the U.S. government, I don't see any daylight for the next 2 years. Whatever happens in the upcoming elections, I'm increasingly doubtful that we will ever see the famous deal of the century, 40 pages, and so on. And I'm pretty sure that if we did see it in what I understand to be the current format, it would be basically a deal that would get people like the Saudis and the Qataris and the Kuwaitis and the UAE to help the Trump administration buy off Palestinians, provide them with some kind of economic benefits in return for them giving up any realistic political objectives. So I think all we can do on the US government is try to get a new government in 2020. You'll have to tell us what you think the Palestinian government authority should do, but I would submit that unless they can get a greater degree of unity between the different wings and factions, including the Gazans, and reconstitute greater support from the Arabs that Washington pays attention to for strategic reasons, which are Egypt, Saudi Arabia, other Gulf states, that will be unlikely. They will be unlikely to really get useful attention here in Washington, or from the Israelis, or even from the Europeans. Now, as to what you might recommend to organizations like HCEF, my church has been a supporter of HCEF for 20 years. We believe in what the organization is trying to do, and like-minded organizations that are trying to help make life better in practical ways for the Palestinians who are there in Jerusalem and in the territories, and also trying as much as possible to improve the perceptions of the American public. My own feeling is that this is basically the humane and moral thing for us to do, but there are people who say, to heck with it, just take this current situation as being so bad that we should cut off all relationships, try to approach Israel-Palestine just as another example of apartheid, and go all out 100%, spend our time organizing demonstrations in front of the White House and the Israeli embassy, and forget about practical efforts to improve life for the Palestinians who are still there.
I share your skepticism on the deal of the century. I think whatever the details are don't matter so much, because we know all that we need to know about the plan. Jerusalem is off the table, refugees are off the table, Palestinian sovereignty is off the table, and the rest, as they say, is commentary. So yes, it's mainly an economic package paid for by Arab Gulf states. And so, but I think given how little there is in this plan, how little substance there is, I'm also doubtful as to whether the deal of the century would ever even see the light of day, or even be publicly announced. I think the focus shouldn't be on the United States. I think there are two real priorities right now for the Palestinians, and that is the situation in Gaza and their own internal domestic political disarray. And the two are related. I think it's very, very important that all sides do everything they can to not just prevent another eruption of war or a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, which that is the direction that Gaza is moving in. But it's not enough to just arrest the situation. Life in Gaza has to be normalized or put on a path towards normalcy. The border operations have to be normalized. And this is one of the great failings of the peace process. The peace process should bring peace. But the peace process has overseen so many and even contributed to moments of violence. And actually, to the earlier questioner, the biggest example of how the failing of this peace process is Gaza, where essentially Palestinian division, which is a key destabilizing force in the region, has become a prerequisite for the peace process. The Mecca Accord, of course, was rejected by the Bush administration, and since then, every U.S. government has basically frowned on Palestinian reconciliation efforts, essentially turning Palestinian division into a requirement of the peace process. That is a completely absurd, if you think in terms of conflict resolution, that is the exact opposite of what conflict resolution is intended to do. And so this is the problem with the U.S. model. But also Palestinians are to blame. I think I can't see why this Palestinian leadership is insisting on putting more sanctions on Gaza, which is, even at a time when Israelis and Americans are sort of backing off and saying, okay, this is too much, even for us. I think that's a real dereliction of duty on the part of the Palestinians. And so that goes to the second point. Palestinians, I think, have to fix their house before, forget about two states or one state or the UN or the Quartet or the EU or the, getting statehood. That's all really, as I see it, just symbolism. It doesn't mean anything if your own house is internally divided. And so I think that's the number one priority of any current or future Palestinian leadership, is to fix their house. Then other things become possible. A diplomatic track, a political full court press with the Arab states, or something at the UN. But no one is going to take it seriously, and it's not going to have any real impact while they're in this state of division and dysfunction.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. The Trump administration's decisions on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict have made absolutely clear that the United States cannot be a more or less neutral or even close to balanced arbitrator or mediator in this conflict. So what are the intended or unintended consequences of these decisions? Who will step up to assume a lead or leading position? Will it be France? Will it be Russia, which has relations with all the parties in the conflict and so on? Will China join in? It's becoming more important in the region. How about the role of the leading Latin American states, Brazil, Mexico, countries in Africa? And please answer the question also in the context of the role of international law in looking at this conflict. What role will the UN play, especially the General Assembly? What role will civil societies in the United States and Europe and perhaps elsewhere play in moving towards a more or less balanced and fair outcome?
All of the international actors that you mentioned are, of course, players in their own right. They have influence, they have assets and equities that they can bring to the table, and that Abu Mazen has been pursuing. France, China, even Russia. But none of these actors, individually or together, have anything like the sort of prestige and clout that the United States brought to this process over the last quarter century or more. The U.S.-led peace process began in the 70s with Kissinger and the Egyptians and Syrians in that process. So there's no one party that has influence with Israel in particular, like the United States. Certainly the French don't. The Russians have a convergence of interests on some level, and good bilateral relations, but Russia is not the player that it used to be, even in the days of what we used to know as the Quartet. Russia played a significant role, at least, you know, a decade or so ago. But, you know, Russia is like other actors are bogged down in other conflicts in the region and have other priorities. So I really don't think, and you know, I hate to sound like a broken record, I really don't think that the answer lies in any of those actors, including the United States. I really think it comes down to Palestinian agency and Palestinians taking matters into their own hands. It's only when Palestinians take the initiative that the diplomatic and political realities change. I think one of the problems with the peace process is that it sort of anesthetized the Palestinians because they had put all of their eggs into the American basket because of their belief, and it became dogmatic, that only the United States can deliver Israel. It's true, only the United States can deliver Israel. But it's also true that the United States won't deliver Israel. And that was true before Trump. Now it's just more emphatic. And so the failing really has been to rely so completely on an American brokered peace process. And now look where this leadership is. They have no plan B. They're flailing. They're grasping at straws. And so I would suggest that all of those tools are important. International law is one avenue that the Palestinian leadership has used mostly tactically, when it could have built a whole strategy around them, for example, through the ICC, which, like other international forums, Abu Mazen has used sort of to tease or as a kind of warning shot with the Israelis, but has not gone full force with those. I think those present real opportunities. And maybe that's what the Palestinian leadership is reassessing now, is to build a strategy around international law, rights, rights-based approach, and using international mechanisms to their advantage. And they're not entirely without leverage, but they haven't used it strategically, and also I think they're handicapped by their own internal weakness and division. It's very, very hard for international actors to take them seriously when Abu Mazen won't even go back to Gaza, even though he has an opportunity to bring the PA back and to govern there. So I really think the process begins with Palestinian agency.
last question, please.
Well, in fact, that was, you've sort of touched a little bit about that. You say that the Palestinian government has to put its house in order. And you started by mentioning, you know, the leader going back to Gaza. What are some of the other strategies specifically do you think that the Palestinian government has to begin doing?
Well, there's a whole, you know, there have been several Palestinian reconciliation agreements, and they're not only between Hamas and Fatah. Those are the two main factions, but they include all the Palestinian factions that were inside or outside the PLO. And they have agreed on a number of issues, you know, not just Gaza. One is reforming the PLO. None of these reforms, of course, have actually been implemented. So the idea is the PLO is the umbrella for all Palestinians inside and outside of the homeland, and it hasn't been for a very long time, for more than 20 years. You have major factions like Hamas and others who are clearly very politically significant but are still outside of the PLO framework. How then is the PLO the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people? That's just a mantra. The PLO was representative because it was genuinely an umbrella that was inclusive of all trends and factions, and it was a very difficult balancing act to maintain that you know, cohesion and consensus internally. And Yasser Arafat was quite good at it in the 70s and the 80s, but the PLO has lapsed, and the PLO has become sort of, you know, it's a shadow of its former self. So reforming the PLO, restructuring the PLO. I'm not sure, you know, some people call for elections in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. I'm not sure that's the solution, because elections are sort of what got us into this mess in the first place. You can't guarantee the outcome. What if Hamas wins again? What if, you know, if they, so I think what's more important than an election should be the product of a political consensus on the basic rules of the game. When you have that, then you can have an election and no one will dispute the outcome. But if you have disagreement on the basic rules of the game, then you get what happened in 2006, where the outcome is not seen as authoritative. The outcome creates more problems than it solves. So, you know, reforming the PLO, making it inclusive. Hamas also has issues that they need to, you know, you cannot be both a government and a resistance movement. There is a tension between them. You know, you need to decide if you're going to liberate the homeland or you're going to govern it, and how you're going to do that. What is the sequence? And so these are all things that Palestinians have to have an internal conversation about. What do you do with the Hamas rockets and weapons and arms that it has? Should those be under the control of the PLO? Who should have access to them? Because you can't have one party that is waging armed struggle at the very same moment that the other party is waging, another Palestinian actor is waging a diplomatic, you know, negotiations kind of approach. You need to decide on one or the other. You know, you can go for armed struggle or you could go for a political process, but you can't do both simultaneously. So, you know, that's just a few examples I think that Palestinians need to address.
Thank you, Khaled. Thank you for both of our speakers for all the great information they shared with us. And thank you all for your thoughts and participation. Our next panel will start shortly.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah and the panelists. Tremendous panel. I want to welcome all of you again Yesterday we had a terrific day together and an evening celebratory dinner. And this morning we're continuing. But before we go to our next panel, I would like to welcome wholeheartedly Dr. Abdul Latif Abu Hijle, who is the president of Birzeit University. He traveled all this distance to be with us, and it's so tremendous to have you with us, and we look forward to hearing your keynote address. Thank you very much. As you know, there is a substantial Christian and Muslim presence in Jerusalem, including religious, educational, and social service institutions and organizations. The challenges include cultural, social constraints, an ongoing Palestinian-Israeli conflict, a 51-year-old occupation, and the lack of funds and funding. This panel will explore what Christians and Muslims are doing to advance the education, culture, and social life in Jerusalem. And now I call upon Father John Predmore, SJ, HCEF board member, to come forward and introduce the panel on enlivening Jerusalem.
Good morning. I'd like to begin, if I may, with a little quote from Thomas Merton about art. Art enables us to find ourselves and to lose ourselves at the same time. The mind that responds to the intellectual and spiritual values that lie hidden in a poem, a painting, or a piece of music discovers a spiritual vitality that lifts itself above itself, takes it out of itself, and makes it present on a level of being that it did not know it could ever achieve. End quote. And I begin with this because I think of, as we begin this presentation, because I think of the old quote that the early Christians dealt with as they moved away from Jerusalem as they were expelled as Jews. And it was a question, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? Which is translated, what does culture have to do with the faith? And the church throughout the centuries has responded to it in separate ways. And the church is always best when it is dealing with it by accepting it and integrating culture and faith together, because they do go together. And I would imagine the different faiths and traditions have experienced the same sort of dynamics. So a lot of times when we think about culture, we don't give it much credibility. It gets diminished and disregarded. It's not as important as the legal aspects, the geopolitical aspects, the other more important aspects of life. But this is the place where we live. We live in the world of beauty. We live in the world of art. And what we're doing here this week is we're telling our stories. And what are the ways that we can tell our stories? We tell our stories to express ourselves, to say what's in our heart, how we're feeling, what our hopes. We tell our stories so that we can educate, so that we can inform others about what is happening in our world. We tell our stories so that we can touch beauty, and when we touch beauty, we are touching the divine. Think about when you go to whatever worship service you are in. In the Catholic Church, you hear a homily, and the priest knows it's going to be a good homily, but he knows that the music has to be good because the person never goes home humming the homily. You gotta give a person something. So we have to begin to see art as mission, as a central part of the mission. And we have to see it as a silent, nonverbal power that we have able to access no matter what our situation. Our words are symbols, as we were alluding to in the questioning. Here, what are the words that we use to describe our situation? Silence is also a symbol. How can we strategically use that? Murals, paintings, images, values. Can we be craftsmen in whatever medium, if it's words or whatever medium we choose to use? There is a video and a TED Talk, a YouTube video and a TED Talk by a former National Geographic photographer, and I owe a lot to the Kingdom of Jordan for my development of the arts. When I went to Jordan as the pastor of the English language parishes, I brought my photography with me, but that also led me to begin to do oil painting. And just 2 weeks ago, I opened my art studio in Boston. I do watercolors and oil paintings. While I was in Jordan, I also sang with the preeminent musical group. So we sang and we danced and we acted. We did the very first Christmas musical, and it was an innovative way to take all of the life of a current Jordanian and bring the message of Christmas to people. The people cried. The people were so proud. They said, we didn't know that we as Jordanians had anything of which to be proud. We love our country. We love our tradition. Music has to move people. Art has to move people. Homilies have to move people. When we were there, we also brought Handel's Messiah to the kingdom, and we modified it. We sang 4 choruses in the Arabic language. We made Messiah. First time it was heard in the kingdom, we made it the people's song. And again, the tears that came down the cheeks of people. I had this one German sister who never smiled, always unpleasant. And I suggested that she might want to come to this concert. And she said, oh, I'd love to go. When are you getting me a ticket? I said, the idea is this is a fundraiser. You buy a ticket, 20 JD, and you come. We'll give it to you for 10-day JD. No. A friend bought a ticket for her, and she came, and she went back the next night buying her own ticket because she was so moved. Someone with a Scrooge-like heart, a religious sister, could be transformed. That's what art can do for people. We have this incredible power at our fingertips if we just learn to harness it. Back to this National Geographic photographer, he's got a video called Celebrating What's Right with the World. And he talks about his experiences as a photographer, looking at something and walking away, and then saying, I wish I took that photograph. And he explains one day he goes to this field of dandelions, beautiful mountain valley with dandelions all in bloom. And he said, oh, this is beautiful. I'll come back tomorrow and take a photograph of it. It would be better lighting then. So he comes back the next day, and they're all powder puffs. The dandelions are gone. He lost his opportunity. And so he starts walking away, and he feels this inspiration. Go back and shoot the powder puffs. And he did that and produced some of the most beautiful images of transparency, the powder puff against the sun, and just kind of brilliant photographs. The idea of this film is, in whatever situation we find ourselves, there is good, and we can celebrate what is right with the world, rather than saying, we were dealt a bad hand. So this talks about that we always have to be ready to change the lens of the camera so that we can see the world just a little differently, so that we can access the beauty that is there, that we can access the divine. And we are talking about Jerusalem. What better place to talk about the beauty of God? what better place to be inspired? What better place to mesh culture with the divine inspiration? So as we go forward, let's think about what images does God want to create through you? How is God going to work through your lives to bring the beauty of God's life into culture? What message do you want to convey? Where are you, O Lord, in Jerusalem? Let's ask God, and let's bring a new image to people so that they can be filled with hope and joy. So let me introduce to you, or call forward, the panelists today. I believe that Imam Hendy is on his way, so we'll begin with Father Michael McDonough, who is the Senior Advisor to the Apostolic Administrator of the Latin Patriarchate in Jerusalem. And if Imam Hendy does not come, I'm sure we can all listen to Father Michael's beautiful speech patterns.
John Schlechter.
And John is over here from the Executive Director of the Bethlehem University Foundation, who is equally as eloquent. So thank you for coming. And would you like to go for, you're on the list first. Okay, thank you.
You've never known me to follow script, so I have a little diversion here. Following on something Father John just said, we're talking about enlivening Jerusalem. Now, it's very easy to recount for you all the institutional things that are occurring, and education, the health sector, elderly homes, youth, scouts, all of those things are very active, and they do contribute to an enlivening of Jerusalem. But they're within a certain sector. Each one brings a certain enlivening, but it also excludes a whole lot of other people that aren't part of those particular institutional activities. So what can we do to enliven Jerusalem? Well, first of all, let's kind of look at the word enliven. It's an interesting thing to do, and in order to stay within the parameters of the title given to us, it's to animate, to make joyous, to make spriteful, to make cheerful. Now, I don't think schools are necessarily going to bring that into their official academic agenda to try and, let's say, make things cheerful when you're studying some very dry subject, necessary as it is. So what I would like to look at is not just the horizontal. You've heard a lot of excellent information, insights, but I'd like to bring in the vertical a little bit more into our thing, because the Creator makes the creature. And now the creature doesn't need to return the compliment and start making the Creator the creature, and the human becomes the creator. That's one of the great difficulties, both in individual spirituality and corporate. We tend to become a needs assessment and then needs addressment. We look to needs to guide us. We neglect something very important, not to neglect the needs by any means, but we need to recognize, who did the Creator make and for what purpose? He owns the earth. He created the universe. Why would we not involve him much more intimately in the process, in the difficulties? So what does he tell us in his word? Put not your trust in princes and mortal men in whom there is no help. And yet what were we doing? We're stuck on Trump, or we're stuck on Obama, or we're stuck on Netanyahu, or whoever else. And God says, what am I telling you, my people? I own the world. Now, if you go to the owner of some enterprise, you stand a much better chance of getting something done within that enterprise's ambit than if we just go outside to other people who are consultors. So I would like to, it's up to each one of us to involve the Savior of the world, the Creator and the Savior, the Sustainer. He's everything. Can we prevent this wedge that we seem to have created between secular and sacred, religious and profane. God made all things that are good. Now, where can we bring the Lord into this process? First of all, I think we have to individually, maybe corporately, listen to him and say, Lord, what do you have to say about this situation? What do you have to say? What do we as a church in particular have to learn? Are we missing something? Is it very simple? That we're so simple we're missing it? Do we pray? Do we fast? Do we long for godly solutions to man's dilemmas? I think we are spinning our wheels year after year, and Khaled pointed out very clearly earlier today, of the whole peace process was such a fantasy and a phantasm put before the eyes and made people drunk with hope. And God says, put not your hope in these men. You know, election times, it's just one lot of sinners out, one lot of sinners in. But we get stuck on Republican and Democrat. God says, why? Be wise, my people, is what the Lord would say to us. Put not your trust in mortal men. That doesn't mean you don't trust some people, but putting your trust in, the prepositions are all very important, I find, in God's word. Next thing, what does the Lord want us to really look at is, Lord, what are you doing about this situation? What's your word? Could we hear in our times God saying what he said to many prophets through, if some who like to call Israel the chosen people? Remember, God kicked them out of their land a few times. Don't be so arrogant, Israel, claiming we're the chosen. Chosen for what is the question? Not chosen. If you're chosen, it's for a purpose. The president of Birzeit University, hopefully, and I know, knows the purpose for which he was called the president of the university. And that's a very important thing to have in place. It strikes me that the modern Israel doesn't know what it's chosen for. It's trying to make things happen that don't really belong. What would happen if the whole technological culture collapsed? Just for the sake of argument. What's the great product of the land of Israel? Is it holiness? Well, we boast of it as the Holy Land and the Holy City, but what does that mean? There is only one who is holy, and it's the Holy God. And he said, would you please broadcast me to the world? That's why I chose you in the beginning. Show the world my integrity, my justice, my peace, my love, my acceptance, my mercy, my kindness. All of those things, but be strong in it. That was the divine vocation. Sadly, it's been abdicated, thrown aside in favor of technology and medical, etc. Several years ago, the speaker of the Knesset wrote a Christmas letter to my boss in Jerusalem. And he said, would you answer it? I said, I'll answer it, but will you sign it? There wasn't a word in there about Merry Christmas, Happy Christmas, Blessed Christmas, nothing. It was all a diatribe on how great Israel is and what we have done in the medical field, the technology, etc., etc. My simple answer was, let not your boast be in the works of your hands. You were called to be a holy people, a royal nation, a people set apart for God's holy purposes. You have failed miserably. Merry Christmas. It wasn't signed. Now, I don't say that to put people down, but if you're going to elevate yourself, you open yourself for every shot that there is in the arsenal. You know, it's blessed Israel can criticize the Christian world and the Muslim world and every other world. If you're going to do that, you better accept criticism of your own thing and don't cry anti-Semitism. We're talking about truth and lies. You know, tell the truth. Now, we need to have a certain rhetoric that challenges them to be what you were called to be if you're going to be this only democracy in the Middle East called now the Jewish state of Israel. Where's the press shouting about this and said, this is not democracy? But we're afraid to do it. So what we have to do, I believe, to enliven Jerusalem, which I believe if Jerusalem is godly enlivened, the world will follow suit, because God is behind the move. Right? We must not act like we have a small God who's a grandfather sitting in his grand chair up in heaven, arms folded and looking down and say, well, boys will be boys and girls will be girls, and look what they're doing. He's intimately involved in everything, but we must get involved intimately with him to know when he's saying, move, stop, go, do this. If our ears, spiritual ears, are not tuned to the divine voice, we will expend energy and look for money and solutions, and it will all collapse. And we'll all be so miserably disappointed. And it's been nicely recounted for us, eloquently recounted for us, statistically recounted for us. And God is saying, now that you know all of that, now where are you going to go? Put your trust again in princes, in mortal men in whom there is no help? Or will we somehow continue to do the horizontal movements with your great energy, but let's make sure it's what the Lord said in his word through one of the Psalms, unless the Lord builds the house, in vain does the builder labor. In vain is your earlier rising and your going later to rest. That's important for us to understand. If God ordains something, give it every ounce of your energy. If you haven't heard it from God and you're giving it every ounce of your energy, it's like taking a pot shot, hoping you've shot in the dark, hope you hit something. It's like a Gaza projectile thrown up in the air, hoping it lands someplace that does damage. You want to be much more economical in movement, in thought, in word, in action. If we're going to enliven Jerusalem, yes, keep our institutional activities going, but let's bring another ingredient into it, and that's the power of God. Godly men and godly women can do amazing things. Why? Because God's power can be right behind it. I'll finish on this one. Some of you, or maybe all of you, are very familiar with the story of the little boy who had 5 loaves and 2 fishes along the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus is surrounded by 5,000 men, not counting women and children. So that's a sizable number. What's 5 loaves and 2 fishes going to do to feed that number? And that was the apostle's dilemma. And he said, give it to me. And what happens? He feeds them all, and 12 baskets full of leftovers. I'm not sure I would like to eat those, but that's what we had left over. Now, what's the message? Very simple for us. Little is much when placed in the hands of God. Left in our hands, we're left desperate. Put your efforts, whatever they are, little or great, in the hands of the Almighty, and watch what he will do. In that way, in some way, we will begin to enliven Jerusalem in a godly way so that it will spread to the rest of the world. May that become a reality. And now let me zip my lip and say au revoir. Thank you.
Good morning. I find it totally unfair that I should follow 2 clerics. This is not easy to do. But I did go to Catholic University for college and for law school, and I actually went with the intention of becoming a priest. So it's I never went into the seminary, but it's good to be with you this morning. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, I think, is what the nuns taught me at Catholic U. Good morning, and thank you, Rateb, for the kind invitation to be here, and congratulations to HCEF on 20 wonderful years of amazing work, and we wish you many more years of that wonderful work. I have to admit, I travel around the United States talking to donors about Bethlehem University and the Bethlehem University Foundation, and talking to an American audience. It's pretty easy to do because everything I talk about when I'm discussing the Christian presence in Bethlehem and Jerusalem is new and enlivening, and it's such a surprise. That's not true with this group, so it's a bit humbling and intimidating to be here with you. I'm a lawyer, so it's a bit like being a second-year law student and trying to explain the Constitution to Justice Scalia. So thank you for listening, and I beg for your patience and understanding. Just a little bit about what the Bethlehem University Foundation is before we talk about the wonderful work of Bethlehem University. I am not an employee of Bethlehem University, and I always make that very clear. I'm the executive director of the foundation. I work not for Brother Peter Bray, but for the board of directors of the U.S. Foundation that I operate. We are a 501c3 not-for-profit corporation organized in the state of New Jersey. We allow U.S. citizens the ability to make tax-deductible gifts in support of Bethlehem University. We are operated not by the university, but by our board of directors. We collect restricted gifts to go to the university, unrestricted gifts so that we can make grants to the university. And third is we support and collect money for an endowment, the endowment of about $25 million that serves in many ways as the lifeline to keep the university operating and successful. But Bethlehem University is unique as an institution. It's a combination of the work of the Vatican and the De La Salle Christian Brothers, and it was created in 1973 by the Vatican at the Congregation for Oriental Churches. But let's talk about why. Pope Paul VI visits the Holy Land. Now St. Paul VI visited the Holy Land in 1964. He encounters a Christian community on the decline. He was the first pope to visit the Holy Land since St. Peter. Two-day trip, the one fact that no one likes to talk about during the trip is that he never used the word Israel. In 1964, the Vatican did not have formal diplomatic relations with the state of Israel. In fact, that didn't happen until the middle 1990s. He visits the Holy Land, he finds the Christian community in decline, and then returns to Rome and says, we have to do something. A number of Christian institutions are created in Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and the surrounding areas, and Bethlehem University is one of them. It's charged by the Holy See and is a joint venture between the Vatican and the De La Salle Christian Brothers. Some of you are graduates of De La Salle Christian Brothers schools. If you're from Jerusalem, you would know them as the Frere. If you're from the Middle East, you would also know them as the Frere. In fact, the school that the Christian Brothers operate, now what was the Frere school in Bethlehem is now the university, and the Collège de Frères in East Jerusalem, which I've always, when people ask what is a good comparison, it's sort of like the Georgetown Prep of East Jerusalem. It's by far one of the best schools in the city. I can say that because there's a few graduates here. So in 1973, Bethlehem University opens its doors. The Archbishop Pio Laghi, who later became the Vatican ambassador to the United States, serves as the first chancellor of the university. He is at that point the apostolic delegate to Jerusalem and Palestine as an archbishop. The Vatican ambassador to the state of Palestine is always the chancellor of the university. In fact, many of you know Brother Peter Bray, who is the quote-unquote president of the university, but he is not the chancellor of the university. He is the vice chancellor to show the connection of the Holy See to the institution that is Bethlehem University. And just a note for those Americans who might be in the room who would have known Archbishop Pietro Sambi. He was the last apostolic nuncio to the United States. He actually died here in the United States, but he, during his tenure as apostolic delegate, was the chancellor of the university. He always used to refer to Bethlehem University as the real star of Bethlehem. So the question is often asked, what is the Vatican doing operating a university in the part of the world where Christians amount to less than 1.8% of the population? I always remind people that when Jesus was there 2,000 years ago, there were no Christians. So we're doing much better. But I just want to talk a little bit about why the university exists and what it's doing for the people of Jerusalem. I think since we are talking about Jerusalem, it's a bit odd that we're talking about Bethlehem University, but I do want to point out that 40% of the students who attend Bethlehem University live in Jerusalem, and so they have to pass through the wall every day in order to get there. First and foremost, Bethlehem University is a major Christian presence in the town where Jesus was born, with a Vatican flag flying over it, that serves all people. I should also note that the majority of the Christian students at Bethlehem University are not Latin Catholics. 51% of the students are Orthodox and 49% are Catholics. It's educating Christians with the skills that they need to find gainful employment in the land, in the Holy Land. Programs like nursing have an almost 100% employment rate. Hospitality and hotel management allow the students to work in, the graduates of the university to work in the hotels in Bethlehem, in the West Bank, in the other parts of the West Bank, and in Jerusalem. If you go to the Ambassador Hotel or the, the Notre Dame Center, the majority of the employees who work at those institutions are graduates of Bethlehem University. I actually went to the Waldorf Hotel last year when I was there, and every person who I met was every employee there was a graduate of Bethlehem University. They did not buy me a drink, but that's okay. I was happy to pay for it myself. Tourism, if you visit the Holy Land and you have a Christian tour guide, the chances are a good chance that that tour guide was educated and formed at Bethlehem University. It's also a place of encounter for the Christian youth, a place where they can attend daily mass, they can go on retreats and do Christian youth catechesis and have a Christian identity. In a place where Christians only make up 1.8% of the population, to have a campus community where Christians make up 25% of the campus, it's a place for them to encounter each other from the various Christian towns where they might come from. A student from Jerusalem can encounter someone from Taipei. Someone from Jericho might meet his future Christian wife at Bethlehem University. And we have stories like that. So it's a place of encounter for the Christians to get to know each other and not live in these isolated, fragmented communities. But it's also a place where Christians and Muslims encounter each other. When you have 75% of the population as Muslim students, many of them encounter Christians at the university for the very first time, and it's a place for them to form friendships, bonds, where they get to know each other, get to know of each other's beliefs. There's actually a course at the university that every student is required to take where you learn about both Islam and Christianity, and in doing so serves as a place of dialogue and encounter where at the end they don't see each other as Christian and Muslims, they see each other as Palestinians, and they see each other as friends. And I think that that is so very important. I do want to, people often ask why should we support a university that's 25% Christian. I always remind people of the story of Cardinal Hickey. Cardinal Hickey was the Archbishop of Washington a number of years ago, and he was speaking at an investiture for the Order of Malta. And he said, we don't serve the poor and the needy and the disenfranchised because they're Christian, we serve them because we're Christian. And I think that really encompasses what Bethlehem University is as a work of the global church, and the university is supported by people from around the world of faith, of no faith, people of goodwill, and people who believe that education is the way forward to building a world based on peace and justice. I think that the university is a living example of Christ's message to serve our neighbors. And Catholic education is the way that the church has been doing that for 2,000 years. You can say whatever you want about the Catholic Church and all of its many failings and shortcomings, especially those that keep coming out in the media, but Catholic education is something that I don't think anyone can question because it has had such an impact on the world. And just a bit of good news about the university as I bring this to a close. Through the generosity of the Order of the Holy Sepulchre, which Rateb is a member of, I'm also a member, the university was given a gift of $1.5 million to build a new building that will house the Faculty of Nursing, and the building is to be called the John Patrick Cardinal Foley Hall. Cardinal Foley was a priest of the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. He later worked in the Vatican and eventually became the Grand Master of the Order of the Holy Sepulchre. The Order of the Holy Sepulchre is a group of Vatican knights and dames committed to the preservation of the Christian communities in the Holy Land. And Cardinal Foley preached at the Red Mass in Washington a few years ago, and he had a great story. He said, I was not sure if I was going to become a journalist or a priest, and so I taught CCD courses in my local parish, and one day Sister walked in the room and asked the students, do you like Mr. Foley? And one girl heroically stood up and raised her hand, and she said, Sister, we don't like Mr. Foley, we love Mr. Foley. And Sister was a bit shocked and said, well, why do you love Mr. Foley? And the young girl quite heroically said, because he teaches us about Jesus. And he said after that it was done, he went into the seminary and spent his life speaking about Christianity, and eventually became Grand Master of the Order and dedicated the remainder of his life to the preservation of the Christian community. And so I think that it's so fitting that at the Vatican's university in the town where Jesus was born, that the School of Nursing, the building that will house the Faculty of Nursing, is named after John Patrick Cardinal Foley, and most especially because the nurses who are educated and healthcare, it's the Faculty of Nursing and Health Sciences. The graduates of that university, of that institution, who will come out of that building, will bring healing to a part of the world that is so very much in need of both physical healing, but also spiritual healing. So thank you very much.
So I don't have any sightings for Imam Hendi, so why don't we just turn to questions you may have for the panelists.
Father John, there seems to be a disconnect between the Latin Patriarchate in Jerusalem and the American Catholic Church. The American Catholic Church, I'm a Roman Catholic, and it's been quite disappointing that the American Catholic Church has relatively been very silent, silent to what is really happening right now with the cuts of the funding for the refugees and the overall Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So on the one hand, you have Christian evangelical Zionists that are very active, and yet you have a large American Catholic community that represents, I think, about 30 or 40% of American Christians that are silent. And so can the Latin Patriarchate do something to engage with the American Catholic Church establishment, such as the U.S. Conference of Bishops, to get them, to become more vocal in the support of Palestinians?
To answer your question very briefly, of course, it should, it can, will it, is the question. What can it do? Well, what did Bethlehem University Board of Directors do? They set up a Bethlehem Fund here. John travels around the country presenting the message to them. The Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem could do that and needs to do that. But it needs to release, let's say, both a priest and a layman who will go around the country, visit with the dioceses, with the bishops, go to their conferences, have a constant presence in the United States. Obviously, the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre have a certain mission in the country, and they do that quite well. But at the same time, there needs to be another dimension, and that's where I think a situation that you mentioned needs to be created, established. It wasn't until 1998 when HCEF was founded with Patriarch Sabah that the Latin Patriarchate began to make some little presence here in the United States. I think it would also help if HCEF was to have a certain, let's say, representation, or the Patriarch there or the Archbishop would say, okay, represent us. We will release a priest to go with you around and spread the message. That would be my opinion on it. Whether the Archbishop Pete Zabala will do that, he's very much aware of it, as is his administrator, Samiel Youssef. Both are, and obviously, when you're an apostolic administrator appointed by Rome, that's another message. Say this is a man who's sent to clean up the situation. When it's cleaned up, it's possible that he'll be moved. So is he going to make a commitment now that the next man coming after him will have to live with? I think he should make that commitment, but he has so many things going on at present in Jerusalem throughout the diocese, which, by the way, covers what, 4 different land, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, Cyprus. So he has many concerns, but I do think this is a very important concern, not just for raising funds, but for raising awareness of many issues that are not being heard clearly through the media here in the United States. Does that in any way? Okay.
And the Conference of Bishops are meeting this week in Baltimore. So all the bishops from the U.S. are gathering, and they're basically talking about one issue: how to survive in this sex abuse crisis. So it's their most pressing concern. They have situations with bishops that are not going so well in their dioceses, and so they're looking at how to set standards for bishops in dealing with the sex abuse. So this is their big preoccupation at the moment, and they're looking for relevancy. They're looking for how can we be a viable church? How do we need to change? They don't have any answers yet, but they're at least coming together to talk about that. So I think that is diverting some attention away from other pressing issues as well.
John.
Father John, I have one for you.
Okay.
Lovely little homily this morning about art and music and beauty. I may be asking a question that's apostasy, but can art, beauty, and music be transactional in a way that will help us to achieve our goals?
Absolutely.
Without violating it?
Absolutely. It progresses it. It explains things in ways, and it speaks to people in many different ways that we can't understand. But we need to use it to portray an image that we want people to see. You go through the Tel Aviv airport, what do you see? Young girls crying because they don't have food. These are young Jewish girls crying because they don't have food. That's what American tourists see when they enter into the airport. What are the messages we are conveying? I don't know that we have set a mission for that, but it's certainly different avenues of approaching music. The music that you choose to listen to is going to be different. That's going to motivate a younger person, and we can be very directive in explaining the beauty that we see in the land, the beauty that we see in this process, the hardships, the suffering. There's all sorts of lament songs that can be created. We've got to use this medium. I'll just use this quote. A work of art opens a void, a moment of silence, a question without an answer, provokes a breach without reconciliation, where the world is forced to question itself. We need to be wise and clever in this regard.
I think HCEF has gone this way a little bit, but might be profitable to take a more formal and broader look at how HCEF might be able to increase its leverage, good, ethical, Christian leverage, by subjecting it to that kind of what do you say, a screening.
Thank you. Okay.
Just want to say that when our church group from Christ the King Lutheran, led by Pastor Hank here, visited the Holy Land in September, we went to a Lutheran school in Betzer, with which we've established a relationship now. And the young children there, boys and girls together, performed, Christians and Muslims, Palestinians, performed several songs, traditional Palestinian dances and songs for us. It was very joyous to see how they work together, perform together. If we could bring that kind of joyous performance to more people in the United States to see how Christians and Muslim Palestinians are interacting together with joy through art and music, I think that might be helpful. And maybe videos of that or bringing groups over might be something, I don't know, that HCEF could do or some other group to help spread that message, because it was keeping alive Palestinian traditions.
And what a great image to present. And what's an invitation? What's the best way to invite people into whatever you're doing? You smile, you dance, you celebrate. People will come if you're happy. So what messages are we, what images are we presenting? The dancing church is always a good one.
Yeah, and as
Church of what the bishops are going
right.
through. They're not dancing today.
Well, this is our great difficulty, isn't it? It's the little ones who are dancing and singing and for joy, and it's the adults who are frowning and discouraged. And while Father John is truly an artist, most people look at circumstances. That's what drags people down. Now, how do you... I remember growing up in Ireland, and it was common somebody say, "How are you today?" And they say, "Well, under the circumstances, not too bad." Okay. So it was years later I heard somebody saying to me, "Well, why are you living under the circumstances? Why are you not above them? How do you get above the circumstances without denying their presence and their reality?" Well, it's a change of mind. Okay. Now, here's a common one, if I may delay for a moment. In most Christian churches on a Sunday, you'll hear, "Holy, holy, holy, Kudus, Kudus, Kudus." Okay, the whole earth is full of his glory. And you're looking around and saying, where? All I see is unglory. Now, it's trees and sunsets and art pictures and flowers that people see the glory of God in. Why? None of that is made in his image and likeness. You and I are. Why are they not looking at us to see this glory, that the whole earth is full of his glory? Because we're not in union with him. We're out of sync. The piper is playing the tune and we're crying. Okay, the dirge is what's being sung, not the hallelujah. So a lot of this enlivening that we're looking for others to do or for pictures to do for us, it works to a point. But then the circumstances far outweigh the picture that I just saw at Tel Aviv airport, right? You go back to your own drudgery again, the gray days. We have to learn, how do you get above the gray days and not let the circumstances, or as the movie said, the tail wagging the dog. That seems to be what's going on in a lot of life, not just in the Middle East. Is circumstances are dragging everyone down. So I say, go to the Lord of all and say, Jesus, our Heavenly Father, mighty God, come. Breathe this mighty breath like a tsunami and blow away all this foolishness that's in the minds and the hearts. That's my kind of Don Quixote figure coming into the reality of Aldonza and her companions.
I just wanted to quickly to follow up. I think we can combine the two questions about how do we get the Catholic Church in the United States more involved, or Christian churches in the United States, especially liturgical Protestants and evangelicals in their theology, we're not going to make much of an impasse, and bringing groups to places like the Lutheran school that you visited. I am shocked, I'm always awed, and I am incredibly frustrated by the number of Christian groups that I find that visit the Holy Land and visit sites but do not encounter that Christian community. And I've had groups that have gone to Bethlehem University who have said that the highlight of their trip was not walking into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, was not renewing their vows at the Mountain of the Beatitudes, but it was sitting there with those Christian kids and Muslim kids talking for a good 20 minutes about what it's like to walk through that wall every day, or what it's like to have someone come into your house in the middle of the night with a gun because you posted something on Facebook. That's the encounter that we need. The bishops, some of the bishops are educated, some of them have no idea about the situation in the Holy Land. But I think that if we're going to really make an impact, hundreds of thousands of Christians travel to the Holy Land each year, and so few of them have that true encounter with what you would refer to as the living stones. And so I think that's something that each of us can do, is when we find that groups are going, reach out to them. say, why aren't you stopping it at this school that you support, or going and talking to the Patriarchate. The Patriarch welcomes groups all the time where they can speak about the situation. So that's my 2 cents. So I'll stop.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the fantastic presentations. And big thank for John, who talked about my university, Bethlehem University, to which I went. I got 4 certificates. I got a bachelor's degree in literature, diploma in education, another diploma in tour guiding, and a marriage certificate where I met my wife and got married. What important for the life of Jerusalem is actually the inhabitants that live in. Jerusalem with only buildings and landmarks and the wall and the shrines is nothing. I think the most important thing is how to improve the lives of the people there. When we learn that we have around 11,000 students in East Jerusalem who cannot go to schools simply because they do not have enough classrooms. This is a very sad reality. And when we learn that we have 140,000 Palestinians living outside the boundaries of the city, and at some point they might lose their residency rights in the city, and they like to come into to live within the city boundaries to maintain their status and residency rights, we should think not only of providing them with houses, but with schools, with healthcare. That's a big responsibility. This is a responsibility that I think falls upon all of us, Muslims, Christians, states, individuals, churches, and everybody in the world. For us as OIC, we identified 3 major sectors that we started to focus on since 2013 in East Jerusalem. One of them is education, healthcare, and housing. Of course, whatever we invest in the city, still it is the minimum or less than the minimum. And I just wanted to raise this point for the attention of the participants and the panelists when we talk about enlivening Jerusalem. Jerusalem without its inhabitants is nothing. And another point regarding the role of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church played an important role and a firm role that was played a couple of times, I remember, in important junctures. One time in 1967, when the well-known hotel, Notre Dame, was confiscated, the Catholic world stood together and forced Israel to reverse the decision of the confiscation of that important landmark in East Jerusalem. Another important thing happened several years ago when Israel decided to confiscate the lands of the Crimson monastery to the west of Bethlehem. And then the Catholic Church stood firm and the decision was reversed. I just wanted to mention this just on opposite to a different thing that everybody knows, which is very unfortunate, that the Orthodox Church, which is its leadership is not Palestinian and not Arab, and it has been associated with very mysterious land sale deals of the properties and the real estate, mainly in Jerusalem and around Jerusalem. That's very unfortunate, and I think it should be addressed very frankly by the religious community in general. Thank you so much.
Yeah, just to give a response to you, Shahar, you're absolutely right. I hold us clergy gravely responsible for enlivening the city of Jerusalem. And I'll just illustrate it briefly. There's a story told about an old wooden church in Kentucky, and it took fire. There was no fire department, so 2 lines were formed. One brought the buckets of water, the other ones took the empty buckets away to have a bag. So this elderly woman in her late 80s was standing in line, and next to her was one of the 60s hippies. And she looked at him and she said, "First time seeing you here at this here church." He said, "Well, ma'am, this is the first time I've seen this church on fire." And somehow we priests need to get on fire, because it's contagious. When somebody is alive and vibrant, things get done. It attracts other people into it, not to the person themselves, but to the activity. And this is where I think, sadly, the Greek Orthodox Church, you were rightly pointing it out, has been pretty much paralyzed by its own choice in the ways it has behaved, and hasn't served the people vibrantly and very well. There are some good individuals within it, but there's a lot of corruption. And sadly, that's where I think we clergy are gravely responsible for doing something good and for some of the sad things that have occurred.
Our last two questions.
Yes, great presentations both days. And I think what we need to do, too, is to be very aware of the importance that we all have as individuals, especially in the U.S., because we are the ones that vote into power the people who make decisions that have such impact, such devastating impact on the people of Palestine. And it's a moral issue. It seems that it's something that all churches need to address. And we all need to do our part. Yesterday when I came back, last night I had an email from Jewish Voices for Peace asking us to get in touch with Cory Booker, who has now decided to co-sponsor legislation, making anybody who supports what little kinds of voices we have on BDS to support that legislation. And so that kind of thing, and asking us to contact him right away, that's something that everybody here can do, everybody who lives here. You can do things individually, you can do things with group, you encourage your church. We had gone several years ago, my husband and I went down to the National Cathedral that was showing a series of films on Palestine. Roadmap to Apartheid is one of them, Two Blue Lines, excellent movies, art, depicting the situation in a way that most people wouldn't see. Even when we went to Palestine, we didn't see all of these things. And so I think because the media has not covered it very well at all, once in a while, but the slaughter of people, I mean, you know, thou shalt not kill. And we're enabling the killing. And so I think we have to assume our individual responsibility and work with whatever organizations are there. What we did after seeing these films is that then we went up to Montgomery County, where I live, said we need to do the same thing. And we did a series of 4 films this fall, and 2 of the films were shown in Catholic churches, just by the Pax Christi group that we were with, saying that we would support and sponsor it. And I think, you know, that's the kind of thing that needs to be done. We need to spread the word about the suffering that we are not only enabling, but we are funding. As citizens, we have a special responsibility for that. And when the UN goes ahead and votes, it's the rest of the world against the United States and Israel. And we cannot, according to the last representative we had, is we cannot say anything bad against Israel. And until that changes, and the people who speak out in this country, you know, make that known to our elected officials, I think it's not going to change. And the same thing with the churches. It's great. You're absolutely right. The bishops and things, some of them have come up with some good statements. The Pope, too, in his visiting to Palestine when he was told by Netanyahu that he would not guarantee his security. He went anyway. And I think that kind of message needs to be down into the pulpits on Sunday, that this is a moral obligation that we have, in addition to all the other ones. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think it's also important to point out that Pope Francis recognized the state of Israel, of Palestine, and has full diplomatic relations, totally uncovered by the Western media.
I'm afraid I don't have a speech. Okay. Where are the flames, ecumenically speaking, in Bethlehem, Beit Sahur, and East Jerusalem, of ecumenical and interfaith creativity that you see beyond just the Roman Catholic Church, or I mean, I know the Greek Orthodox situation, but where are the flames of partnership and energy where you are seeing some hope?
For me, it's in the streets. I've given up on the denominations to do anything very positive. There's that 1 week at the beginning of January, which is the Greek Orthodox. One of the monks several years ago said to a priest friend of mine, who said to him, "Are you coming to the week of prayer?" And he said, "We don't need it. You all left us. You need to come back to us." Now, that's an extreme statement of it, but that's the ennui, the no energy left to do anything creative other than this thing that's done every year. It's the people. I see Orthodox, Catholics, Syrian Orthodox, Armenians, all mingling together. I'd like to go walk in the streets, so much so that the previous patriarch said to me, "You know more people in this city than I do." And I said, "Well, can you ask yourself why?" I go into the streets, I talk to Muslim shopkeepers, I talk to anybody. So that's the only way I see a certain ecumenical activity, if I may put it. It's only going to be on the level of friendship and hospitality and welcoming others. Doctrine, I leave that to the others because it's going nowhere.
I think I've seen that with some of the students at the university. We have, there were a group of students who were here this summer, and one girl, her father was Latin Catholic, and her mother was Greek Orthodox. And she said, "I'm a Christian, and it's Greek Orthodox, Latin, it doesn't matter. I get 2 Christmases out of it." And I thought that there was something very simple, but also something very deep about that, that she didn't identify herself as either Latin Catholic or Greek Orthodox. She was, I mean, 3 Christmases, that would be wonderful. I think that on the ground, when you're 1.8% of the population, you don't worry about your denomination, you worry about your Christianity. And I think that the Christian institutions who serve all Christians and then all of society all speak to that ecumenical message of who we are as Christians, not because, serving people not because they're Christian, but because we are. And I'm always amazed, any group that visits Bethlehem University, it goes into a database, and I have to write a letter to that group saying, "Thank you for your visit." I am surprised by the number of Protestant groups who are willing to visit the Vatican's university in the town of Bethlehem, because it's a work not only of the Catholic Church, but of the global Christian world in preserving Christianity and a work of social justice. For 9 years, I was general counsel of the Archdiocese for Military Services, so I was the Archbishop's lawyer. For me to then transition to a job where I'm writing to a bishop and her husband is very different and very enlightening, and I think that it's absolutely wonderful that groups like that are visiting, and that a Catholic group will go to a Lutheran school, and that we're supporting each other in our works.
My next door neighbors, Linda and her husband, are Syrian Orthodox. Below me is a Baptist couple, then I have Greek Orthodox. And I live in an apartment. I don't live with the other priests because I like to stay in touch with the local people. And I get mansaf, idri, makhlube, fasulia, kusa, everything. So my ecumenical activity is around the lunch table or the dinner table. That's why I have 13 more kilos on me since I went to Jerusalem.
I'm going to finish with a quote.
Excuse me, can I just ask one question?
Yeah, we just have 30 seconds. 30 seconds.
Okay,
30 seconds, please.
I want to know, how come there are no Quakers represented?
That's a question for Rateb later.
Okay, all right. Okay, thank you for your response.
Okay. I don't have the answer. Rateb does.
He's not the boss.
I have Rateb breathing down my neck, so. But I just want to finish with a quote that I heard 6 years ago. I'm going to get it completely wrong, but bear with me. Biktup bismek ya bladi, al shamsil ma bitagrib, la malo walo ladi, ala hubbik wali habib. La 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 la. La 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 la. Thank you to our panelists. We'll take your question.
Don't dance after that one.
leave it to a Jesuit to steal the show. Absolutely.
Thank you, John. Thank you. I'm helping brother very well. Yeah, when I was in the 40s, I was doing some.
Okay, we're not quite on break. I'd like to ask Sir Rateb Rabi to come up and introduce a video that we're going to be playing at this time.
I don't know if it succeeded or not, but I connected them with the Islamic Development Plan for a grant.
Okay, Bethlehem is over for you now. Bethlehem University. Yeah. Okay, everyone. I just want to make a small presentation about HCEF, you know, because this is not all what we do, all these political activities and conferences. We have a lot of things we do around here and around the world. And she asked a question and she left. Anyway, maybe Najat, sit down, maybe you can tell her, you know, yeah, because, you know, I mean, you know, we have a problem with our Christianity. That's why. You know, you go to Muslim, you have a Muslim and Jewish, and you have Christians about how many denominations. How can I get from each denomination, one then will have, you know, more speakers than the audience. And this is why we don't have, and we are always happy to hear and recommend, you know, what we do, okay? The thing here is HCEF goes and reach out to every Palestinian around the world, okay? And it doesn't matter Christian or Muslim, it's just we use our Christianity for our cause as, you know, the Zionists, you know, or whoever you want to call them, you know, they became Christians more than the Christians, and they start acting like that against us, okay? And here the things is that one of the things I want to introduce a person here. I went to Honduras, and this man was his daughter. Maybe you saw her last night. She's active with us.